Imagine you are on vacation in Hawaii and it's a beautiful morning, so you decide to go ahead and go out on a run. As you're going throughout your run, you start seeing some cats, and then you start seeing groups of cats. And by the end of your 3 mile run, you've now seen about 10 cats. I suppose you're wondering by this point, why are they there? What's the point of all this? And what you're actually witnessing is called an invasive species. Now, rest assured, I understand that the word invasive does have a negative connotation to it, but that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm not here to talk to you about how bad or good invasive species are. What I am here to talk to you about today is the process in which invasive species does affect environments at different ecological levels. So in this presentation, I will introduce you to this Hawaiian invasive species and the organisms that they affect, as well as how they have a ecosystem-wide effect. So I bet you're wondering by this point, what is this invasive species? And this invasive species are called feral cats. Now, feral cats are a wild variant of the regular cats that we see domesticated in households. But the difference is that these cats didn't grow up with human contact or human connection, so they're not used to it. And according to the Hawaiian Invasive Species Council website, they are present on all islands and even in different parts of the world. And in a 2016 publication by the U.S. Geological Services, European explorers brought them in the 1800s on their ships to keep control of the mice and rats. And they did a great job at that. And they remained on the Hawaiian Islands. And after their arrival, the same publication talks about how they were the largest predator-type animals in the area, and which leads me to my next point. Invasive species can affect native organisms. So feral cats do affect and are predators to native birds and native insects in Hawaii. I have two examples of native birds here, the palela bird, which is an endangered species, and the nene bird, which is a Hawaiian goose. They also affect marine mammals as well as humans. They do this through parasites in their feces, which contaminate water and can cause a disease called toxoplasmosis. Now, according to Mayo Clinic's website in 2020, toxoplasmosis is a disease which can affect pregnant women as well as people with suppressed immune systems due to any pre-existing conditions that they may have. Now, it may seem like it stops there, but I'm sure that we all remember learning in middle school about how if you interrupt one part of the food chain, all the other parts then follow, and it's almost a cascade type of event, which leads me to my next point. Invasive species can impact whole ecosystems. So predatory habits can result in extinction. In her book, Invasive Species, Ecology Management Strategies and Conservation, Jane Sutton explains how predatory invasive species can cause extinction, especially in endangered species, and they can impact ecosystems, and because of that, it can impact the humans around that rely on those ecosystems. And those human impacts manifest their way in human behavior as well as the food and water that we consume. David Finoff, in his 2010 journal article, best explains this. His journal article is called Invasive Species and Endogenous Risks. In it, he describes the cyclic impact in which changes in the ecosystem can affect human behavior, especially economic behavior, and that in return can further change the ecosystem. So I'm sure by that we've learned that this topic of invasive species is just so much more relevant than I think we give it credit for, and because of that, we should be learning about it more. But to summarize today, I introduced you to a invasive species in Hawaii called feral cats, and I introduced you to the organisms in which they affect and impact, and because of that, how they then have a impact on ecosystems in Hawaii. But I also just think it's so important for us to learn about it because it's so fascinating to see how this one species can have such a large such a large impact on environments at different ecological levels, and how that in turn affects us as humans because we rely on those ecosystems, which is why I think it's so important for us to just look at this information and start learning about it. Thank you. I will now open up the floor for questions. Yes. Okay, so the question was, can plants be invasive species as well, or just animals? And the answer is plants can also be considered invasive. So an example that I can give you is a fire tree is an invasive shrub in Hawaii. Are there any other questions? Yes. Okay, so the question was, what is the criteria that needs to be met for a species to be considered invasive? So it has to meet a few criteria in order to be considered invasive. The species needs to be non-native to the place in which we're talking about, and whenever it spreads, it needs to harm other organisms around it, as well as it has the potential to harm humans as well as the economy. So if there are no more questions, then thank you.